Commander Zethkar had conquered 17 star systems before he learned what true terror felt like. It wasn't the screaming void of space combat, or the bone-crushing pressure of a dying world's gravity well, or even the silent madness that claimed so many deep space warriors. No, true terror came in the form of a single human female, barely reaching his chest plates, who looked him straight in his four eyes and smiled while her homeworld burned behind her. She held a plasma rifle in one hand and a crying infant in the other, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of something that made his ancient warrior's soul recoil. "You picked the wrong species to hunt," she said, and in that moment, Zethkar realized that his people, the apex predators of the galaxy, the unstoppable Kethmori war machine that had never known defeat, had just made their first and final mistake. What followed would rewrite everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare, survival, and the terrifying lengths one species would go to protect their own. This is the story of how humanity taught the universe that there are things far worse than death, and sometimes the prey becomes the predator in ways that defy all logic and reason. The war that followed would be remembered not for its tactics or technology, but for the moment when an entire galaxy learned to fear the sound of human laughter in the dark. Commander Zethkar stood on the bridge of the war dreadnought Bone Crusher, his four eyes scanning the tactical displays with practiced efficiency. The blue-green world below them spun slowly, unaware that it had just become the 18th conquest in his flawless military career. The planet's primitive electromagnetic signals had been broadcasting into space for barely 2 centuries, a sure sign that whatever species lived there had only recently discovered basic technology. "Energy readings are minimal, Commander," reported his tactical officer, Lieutenant Vexlon, her chitinous carapace gleaming under the bridge lights. "No orbital defenses detected. No signs of advanced weaponry. Their largest settlements show technology equivalent to our ancestors from 3,000 cycles ago." Zethkar nodded, his massive frame settling into his command throne. At 8 feet tall and covered in natural bone armor that had deflected countless weapons over his 500 years of life, he was the epitome of Kethmori military superiority. His people had evolved on a death world where only the strongest survived, where pack hunting and tactical brilliance meant the difference between eating and becoming someone else's meal. Every aspect of their society had been refined for war, from their redundant organ systems to their ability to see across multiple light spectrums. "Standard conquest protocol, then," he rumbled, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never known defeat. "We'll establish orbital superiority, identify their major population centers, and begin the systematic harvest. The weak ones will be processed for labor, the strong ones for the arena pits back home. Any that show exceptional promise will be inducted into our auxiliary forces." It was a routine that had played out 17 times before, across 17 different worlds. The Kethmori Empire had perfected the art of conquest to such a degree that resistance had become almost theoretical. Most species surrendered within hours once they realized the technological gap they faced. Those that didn't were usually extinct within days. "Scanning their military installations now, Commander," Vexlon continued, manipulating holographic displays with 6 dexterous limbs. "They have what appears to be a global network of defensive positions, but the weapons are chemically propelled projectiles. Primitive nuclear capabilities, but nothing that could threaten our shields." The bridge crew, composed of the finest warriors the Kethmori military academies could produce, worked with smooth precision. Every movement was economical, purposeful. They had been bred for this, trained from birth, to be the perfect instruments of galactic domination. Their ships were technological marvels, their tactics proven across countless battles, their resolve unbreakable. "Wait." Vexlon's voice carried a note of confusion that made Zethkar's primary eyes focus on her. "Commander, I'm detecting something unusual." "Explain." "The species down there, they call themselves humans. But sir, their settlements don't follow standard prey species patterns. Most conquered worlds show clear hierarchical structures, with the majority of the population concentrated around resource centers or natural defenses. These humans are spread across every continent, even in areas that should be uninhabitable." Zethkar felt a slight twinge of curiosity. In his experience, species that spread themselves thin were easier to conquer but took longer to completely subjugate. It usually meant more hunting, which while entertaining could delay their schedule. "Are they migratory?" "No, sir, permanent settlements." "But that's not the strange part. Commander, they've somehow established cities in regions with extreme temperatures, on floating platforms in their oceans, even in underground complexes. It's like they've deliberately chosen to live in the most challenging environments possible." The commander's third eye opened, a sign of increased attention among his species. "Show me their communication intercepts." The main display shifted to show streams of electromagnetic data flowing across the planet's surface. Unlike most pre-space civilizations, which typically showed organized, efficient communication patterns, the human networks were chaotic, almost frenzied in their complexity. Thousands of different languages, millions of simultaneous conversations, data flowing in patterns that seemed to defy logical organization. "Can our translation matrices make sense of this?" Zethkar asked. "Working on it, sir. But there's something else. They seem to be aware of us." The bridge fell silent except for the humming of ship systems. Zethkar's fourth eye opened, something that only happened when he sensed potential threat. In 5 centuries of warfare, very few species had detected Kethmori scout ships before the main invasion force arrived. Impossible. Our stealth systems are generations beyond anything they could detect. Nevertheless, sir, I'm intercepting communications that specifically reference alien contact and invasion fleet. They know we're here. Before Zethkar could respond, his communications officer, a veteran named Grixtal, looked up from his console with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Commander, we're receiving a transmission. It's directed at us specifically. And sir, it's in perfect Kethmori military dialect." The bridge temperature seemed to drop several degrees. In the entire history of the Empire, no primitive species had ever managed to learn their language, much less address them directly. "Put it through," Zethkar commanded, his voice steady despite the growing knot of unease in his stomach. The main display flickered, and suddenly they were looking at a human. The creature was smaller than any of them, its skin a pale pink-brown color, with only 2 eyes and what appeared to be a completely soft, unarmored body. It looked fragile, almost pathetically vulnerable, but when it spoke, its words were crisp and clear in their own tongue. "Greetings, Commander Zethkar of the War Dreadnought Bone Crusher. My name is Dr. Sarachen, and I represent the UN of Earth. We need to talk." The silence on the bridge stretched for long seconds. Zethkar felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries. Genuine surprise. Not only had this human learned their language, but she somehow knew his name and the designation of his ship. "How do you know who I am?" he finally asked. The human's face arranged itself in what their cultural databases identified as a smile, though it seemed different from the expressions they'd cataloged from other species. Less submissive, more confident. "We've been watching your empire for quite some time, Commander. We know about the 17 worlds you've conquered. We know about your tactics, your technology, your culture. We know about the arena pits where you send the strongest of your captives to fight for your entertainment. We know about the processing centers where the weak are turned into slave labor. We know exactly what you came here to do to us." Zethkar felt his combat instinct starting to engage. This conversation was moving into territory he'd never encountered before. No prey species had ever spoken to him with such casual knowledge of Kethmori practices. "If you know what we are capable of, then you understand the futility of resistance," he replied, falling back on the standard intimidation protocols. "Surrender now, and your species will be treated according to our conquest codes. Fight and face extinction." The human's smile widened, and for reasons he couldn't explain, Zethkar felt his skin crawl. "Oh, we're not going to surrender, Commander, but we're also not going to fight you. Not in the way you expect, anyway." She leaned forward slightly, and her next words carried a weight that made the veteran warrior actually step back from his display. "You see, you've made one fundamental error in your analysis of our species. You think we're prey. You are prey," Vexilon interjected from her station. "Your technology is primitive, your military forces scattered and weak, your defense is laughable. You have no orbital capability, no energy weapons, no armor that could stop our hunters. By every metric that matters, you are prey." The human turned her attention to his tactical officer, and Zethkar was disturbed to see that Vexilon actually flinched under that gaze. "Lieutenant Vexilon, isn't it? Graduate of the Kethmori Advanced Tactical Academy, specialist in siege warfare and urban pacification. You've participated in 7 planetary conquests, including the fall of the Xerian Confederacy. You wrote a dissertation on optimizing psychological warfare against technologically inferior species." Vexilon's carapace had gone pale. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because we've been preparing for this meeting for a very long time," Dr. Chen replied. "You see, while you've been busy conquering worlds and perfecting your techniques against species that had no warning, no preparation, and no idea what they were facing, we've been doing something different. We've been learning everything there is to know about you, Zethkar." Found his voice? Learning from where? "We've never encountered your species before today. No, but you've encountered others. And Commander, one thing you might not know about humans is that we're very good at talking to survivors. We're excellent at finding the ones who escape, who hide, who manage to slip through your nets. We're particularly good at listening to their stories. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees. In the back of his mind, Zethkar acknowledged what his training was telling him. This was not proceeding according to any scenario they'd prepared for. Over the past 50 years, the human continued, we've made contact with refugees from each of the worlds you've conquered. The ones who managed to steal ships and flee before you could catch them. The ones who hid in the deep places and eventually found ways off their dying worlds. The ones who escaped from your processing centers and arena pits. Do you want to know what they all told us, Commander? Despite himself, Zethkar found that he did want to know. They told us that the Kethmori are the most efficient predators in the galaxy, that you've perfected warfare to such a degree that resistance is futile, that you're faster, stronger, better armed, and more tactically sophisticated than anyone you've ever faced. Her smile became something sharp and hungry. They also told us that you've never faced a species that had time to prepare, that you've never fought anyone who knew you were coming, that your entire tactical doctrine is built around technological and informational superiority over unsuspecting prey. Zethkar felt the first stirrings of what might have been concern. Your point? My point, Commander, is that you're not hunters anymore. As of today, you've become something else entirely. Dr. Pao P. Chen's image leaned back in her chair, and her expression became something that made every warrior on the bridge unconsciously check their weapons. You're about to learn what it's like to be prey. The transmission cut out, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. For several long moments, nobody moved. Then Grixtal spoke up from his communications station. Commander, we're detecting massive energy surges across the planet's surface. Every major city, every military installation, every population center, they're powering something up. Weapons? Zethkar asked, though his gut told him it wasn't going to be that simple. Unknown, sir. The energy patterns don't match anything in our databases. But Commander, Grixtal's voice carried a note of something that might have been fear. The power output is enormous. Each of their major cities is generating more energy than some of our battle stations.
Vexal was frantically working at her console, her 6 limbs moving in blur of activity. Sir, I'm detecting movement in their orbital space.
They're launching something. Multiple somethings. Hundreds of launch signatures. Missiles?
No, sir.
There, Commander, I think they're evacuation ships. Zethkar stared at the tactical display as hundreds of small craft began lifting off from the planet's surface. But instead of fleeing in random directions as panicked evacuees should, they were moving with military precision towards specific coordinates in space. They're not evacuating, he realized with growing unease. They're repositioning. And in the depths of space around Earth, ancient defense platforms that had been disguised as asteroids and space debris for decades began to power up. Their human crews emerging from century-long cryogenic sleep to man weapons that had been built not to stop an invasion, but to ensure that any invader would never leave to threaten another world. The hunt was about to begin, and for the first time in his long military career, Commander Zethkar was beginning to suspect he might not be the hunter. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came 6 hours after Dr. Chen's transmission ended. Zethkar had ordered a standard orbital bombardment of the planet's major population centers, expecting to see the usual pattern of panic, surrender negotiations, or desperate last-minute defensive actions. Instead, his weapons simply stopped working. Tactical report, he commanded from his throne, watching as his crew frantically worked their stations. Lieutenant Vexilon's carapace had developed a sickly pale hue that Zethkar had never seen before. Sir, our primary weapons are non-responsive. All energy-based systems are showing massive power fluctuations. It's as if something is actively interfering with our plasma generation matrices. Switch to kinetic weapons. Already tried, Commander. The magnetic accelerators are experiencing similar disruptions. Whatever they're doing down there, it's affecting our ship's systems at a fundamental level. Zethkar's primary combat instincts were fully engaged now. In 5 centuries of warfare, he had never encountered anything that could disable Kethmori weapon systems. Their technology was based on principles that had been refined over millennia, tested against every known form of electronic warfare and defensive screening. How is that possible? Before Vexilon could answer, Communications Officer Grixtal spoke up from his station. Commander, we're receiving another transmission from the planet. Same source as before. Put it through. Dr. Chen's image appeared on the main display again, but this time she was wearing what appeared to be some kind of military uniform. Behind her, Zethkar could see what looked like a command center, with dozens of humans working at consoles displaying information that made his tactical training scream warnings at him. "Good evening, Commander," she said pleasantly. "I trust you've noticed that your weapons aren't working properly." "What have you done?" Zethkar demanded. "We've introduced a few modifications to your local space-time environment, Doctor." Chen replied casually as if discussing the weather. "Nothing too dramatic, just some carefully positioned gravitational anomalies and electromagnetic field generators. The refugees from your previous conquests were very helpful in explaining exactly how your weapons systems function." Grixtal was working frantically at his console. "Commander, she's not lying. I'm detecting massive gravitational distortions throughout our local area. They've somehow created artificial gravity wells that are interfering with our plasma containment systems." "That's impossible," Vexilon protested. "Gravitational manipulation on that scale would require technology centuries beyond what they've demonstrated." "Doctor," Chen's smile became something sharp and predatory. "Lieutenant, you're making the same mistake your species always makes. You assume that technological development follows a linear path, that everyone discovers things in the same order you did. We've had 50 years to focus exclusively on technologies specifically designed to counter Kethmori weapons and tactics. We didn't waste time developing better plasma cannons or stronger armor. We developed things you've never seen before because you've never needed defenses against them." The display shifted to show a tactical overview of the space around Earth. Zethkar felt his blood turn cold as he saw what the humans had accomplished. Hidden throughout the asteroid belt, disguised as natural formations, were massive installations that were generating interlocking fields of gravitational interference. Each installation was larger than a Kethmori battle station, and there were dozens of them. 50 years of preparation, Dr. Chen continued. 50 years of listening to survivors describe your tactics, your weapons, your standard operating procedures. 50 years of building a defense specifically tailored to stop you and only you. You couldn't have hidden construction on that scale, Zethkar objected, though his certainty was beginning to waver. Our scouts would have detected it. Your scouts were looking for conventional military installations, Commander. They were scanning for energy signatures and weapons signatures and population centers. They weren't looking for hollowed-out asteroids filled with humans who had been in cryogenic suspension for decades, waiting for this specific moment. The tactical display updated again, and Zethkar saw something that made his combat-hardened mind struggle to process the implications. The human evacuation ships that had launched earlier weren't evacuation ships at all. They were revealing themselves as heavily armed combat vessels, each one painted with hull markings that his cultural databases identified as belonging to the various alien species his empire had conquered. "Those are Zirian hull configurations," Vexilon whispered, "and Zalathi defensive patterns, and Morkan engine signatures. Commander, how do they have our victims' technology?" Dr. Chen's expression became something that made Zethkar's predator instincts scream danger warnings. "Because we didn't just talk to the survivors, Lieutenant. We hired them. Every refugee who made it off a conquered world, every escaped slave who managed to steal a ship, every arena fighter who won their freedom. We offered them something your empire never could." "What?" Zethkar asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. "Revenge." The space around the Bone Crusher suddenly filled with ships. Not human ships, but vessels from a dozen different species, each one carrying technology and crew members that the Kethmori Empire had thought were extinct or enslaved. Zirian stealth cruisers materialized out of empty space. Zalathi heavy assault platforms dropped their camouflage fields. Morkan fighters swarmed in formations that spoke of careful training and coordination. "You see, Commander," Dr. Chen continued as the alien fleet formed up around Zethkar's dreadnought, "humans have a particular talent that you don't seem to possess. We're very good at making friends with people who have been hurt. We're excellent at building alliances with those who have been wronged. And we're absolutely exceptional at organizing cooperative efforts aimed at removing mutual threats." Zethkar was beginning to understand the scope of what was happening, and the realization filled him with something he had never experienced before in combat: genuine fear. "You've been building an alliance. All this time, you've been gathering our enemies. Not your enemies, Commander. Your victims. There's a difference." Dr. Chen's image shifted, and suddenly Zethkar was looking at a Zirian female whose scarred face spoke of years in Kethmori arena pits. When she spoke, her words were in perfect Kethmori military dialect. "Greetings, Commander Zethkar. I am Battle Leader Sixandra of the Zirian Survivor Fleet. Do you remember me?" Zethkar did remember her. She had been the champion of Arena Complex 7, undefeated in over 300 matches before she had somehow managed to escape during a transport failure. He had personally signed the order to hunt her down and eliminate her as an example to other potential escapees. "You were declared dead," he said. "I was declared free," she corrected. "Free to spend the last 40 years training with human military advisors, learning to coordinate Xerian stealth technology with human tactical doctrine. Free to gather other survivors and teach them how to work together instead of dying alone. Free to plan for this moment." The display shifted again, showing a Zalathi engineer whose cybernetic implants covered half his body. "Engineering Master Vorthikon of the Zalathi Reconstruction Corps," he announced. "Your processing centers left me more machine than biological, Commander. The humans gave me something better to do with those modifications than process raw materials for your empire." And then a Morkan pilot, her flight suit scarred by decades of combat. "Squadron Leader Jexwari of the Free Morkan Fighter Wings. Your people destroyed my homeworld and enslaved my children. The humans helped me rescue them and train them to ensure this never happens to anyone else." One by one, representatives of every species the Kethmori had conquered appeared on the display. Each one bore the marks of their enslavement, but also carried themselves with the confidence of trained military personnel. This wasn't a desperate last stand by scattered survivors. This was a coordinated military operation by a multi-species alliance that had been planning for decades. "How many ships do you have?" Zethkar asked, his tactical mind trying to assess the threat despite the growing certainty that the answer wouldn't matter. "Dr. Deus." Chen reappeared on the display. "Enough. But Commander, you're still thinking in terms of conventional naval engagement. You're still trying to figure out how to fight us. That's not what's happening here." "Then what is happening here? You're being arrested." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Zethkar felt his world tilt on its axis as concepts he had never considered forced their way into his consciousness. "Arrested? By whom? For what?"
"By the Galactic Refugee Tribunal, Commander."
"For crimes against sapient species, for genocide, for systematic enslavement, and for conducting aggressive warfare against 17 innocent civilizations."
"Doctor!"
Chen's expression became something cold and implacable. "You see, while you've been perfecting the art of conquest, we've been perfecting the art of justice. We've spent 50 years documenting your crimes, gathering evidence, recording testimony from survivors, and building legal frameworks that can hold predator species accountable for their actions." Vexlon looked up from her console with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Sir, they're not targeting our weapons or engines. They're using some kind of containment field to lock us in position. It's not an attack, it's a arrest warrant being executed by naval forces." Zethkar realized that everything he thought he understood about warfare, about conquest, about the relationship between predator and prey species, was being systematically dismantled in real time. The humans hadn't prepared to fight the Kethmori Empire. They had prepared to judge it. "You can't simply declare us criminals and expect us to submit to your authority," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than he intended. "Actually, we can." "Doctor," Chen replied. "You see, Commander, one thing humans are exceptionally good at is building institutions. We've spent decades establishing legal frameworks, creating judicial bodies, developing enforcement mechanisms. The Galactic Refugee Tribunal has been recognized by 43 different species as the legitimate authority for crimes committed against refugee populations." "What species? You've never made contact with anyone outside this system." "Haven't we?" Dr. Chen's smile became something that made Zethkar's skin crawl. "Commander, did you really think that 17 civilizations worth of refugees wouldn't eventually start talking to each other? Did you assume that survivors scattered across the galaxy wouldn't eventually find ways to communicate, to share information, to coordinate responses to mutual threats?" The tactical display updated to show something that made Zethkar's mind struggle to process the implications. Ships were emerging from hyperspace all around the Sol system. Not human ships or vessels from conquered worlds, but craft bearing the emblems of species the Kethmori had never encountered. Dozens of different configurations representing dozens of different civilizations, all moving in coordinated formations that spoke of careful planning and shared command structures. "The Altarian Federation sends their regards," Dr. Chen announced as a massive vessel that dwarfed even the Bone Crusher moved into position. "They've been very interested in meeting the species that's been driving refugees into their territory for the past 2 centuries. Another ship, this one sleek and organic-looking, took position on their other flank. Basetian Collective has some questions about the survivors who arrived in their space with stories of systematic genocide. A third vessel, its hull covered in weapon emplacements that made Kethmori technology look primitive, moved to block any possible escape route. And the Terran Colonial Alliance would like to have a word about the disruption of peaceful interstellar commerce caused by your expansion activities. Zethkar stared at the display, his mind trying to process the scale of what the humans had accomplished. While the Kethmori Empire had been focused on conquest and expansion, never looking beyond their next target, the humans had been building something entirely different. They had been creating networks, establishing relationships, forging alliances based not on fear or dominance, but on shared values and mutual cooperation. "This is impossible," he whispered. "No one has ever coordinated this many different species. The logistical challenges alone, the communication barriers, the cultural differences." "You're right," Dr. Chen agreed. "It's incredibly difficult to build lasting alliances between different species. It requires patience, understanding, compromise, and a willingness to put shared interests ahead of individual advantages. Fortunately, humans are very good at exactly those things." She leaned forward in her chair, and her next words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You see, Commander, your empire has been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of intelligent species. You assumed that the galaxy was divided into predators and prey, dominators and the dominated. You thought that power came from the ability to impose your will through force." The display zoomed in on Dr. Chen's face, and Zethkar saw something in her eyes that made him understand, for the first time in his life, what true strength looked like. "But power doesn't come from the ability to destroy, Commander. Real power comes from the ability to build. Real strength isn't measured by how much damage you can inflict, but by how much healing you can accomplish. Real victory isn't about conquering your enemies. It's about turning them into friends." And as the combined fleet of 43 different species moved into final position around the Bone Crusher, Commander Zethkar began to understand that his empire hadn't just encountered humanity, they had encountered something far more dangerous than any predator species could ever be. They had encountered hope. The transport that carried Commander Zethkar from the Bone Crusher to the massive tribunal station was unlike anything in his experience. Instead of the cramped utilitarian prisoner transports he expected, he found himself in a spacious compartment with transparent walls that offered a clear view of the construction marvel they were approaching. The Galactic Refugee Tribunal Station was a masterpiece of cooperative engineering. Sections built by Xerian architects flowed seamlessly into Zalathi industrial modules, which connected to Morkan residential areas and human administrative centers. Dozens of different architectural styles and technological approaches had been woven together into something that shouldn't have worked, but somehow created a structure of breathtaking beauty and functionality. "Impressive, isn't it?" Dr. Chen sat across from him, no longer wearing military attire, but dressed in what appeared to be formal judicial robes. "It took us 30 years to build. Every species contributed what they were best at. The Altarians provided the gravitational engineering, the Cetians handled the biological life support systems, the Morkans designed the transportation networks, humans coordinated the project and handled the legal frameworks." Zethkar had remained silent during the journey from his captured ship, but the sight of the station forced him to speak. "How many species contributed to this?" 87 at last count. Every civilization that has ever taken in refugees from Kethmori conquests. Every culture that has lost members to your expansion. Every society that has chosen to help, rather than exploit those fleeing your empire. The transport docked at a bay designed to accommodate dozens of different ship configurations simultaneously. As they disembarked, Zethkar found himself in corridors filled with beings from across the galaxy. Not scattered refugees or desperate survivors, but professionals in uniforms representing dozens of different organizations, all moving with the purposeful efficiency of people engaged in important work. "The tribunal employs over 50,000 beings," Dr. Chen explained as they walked through halls lined with artwork from hundreds of different cultures. "Investigators, attorneys, judges, researchers, historians, psychologists, sociologists. We've been preparing for cases like yours for decades." They entered a vast chamber that took Zethkar's breath away. The courtroom was designed as an amphitheater, with seating arranged in concentric circles around a central floor. But instead of a single judge's bench, there were dozens of judicial positions, each designed to accommodate different species' physiological and cultural needs. Representatives from every major galactic civilization sat in judgment, their diverse forms united by expressions of solemn attention. "The Honorable Tribunal will come to order," announced a being Zethkar didn't recognize, its translation device rendering the words in perfect Kethmori. "We convene today to hear testimony in the matter of the galactic community versus Commander Zethkar of the Kethmori Empire and his associated military forces." Chen guided him to a defendant's area that had been specially configured for Kethmori physiology. As he settled into the seat, he noticed something that sent chills through his combat-hardened psyche. The gallery was filled with hundreds of beings, and he recognized many of them. Survivors from worlds he had conquered, escaped slaves from processing facilities he had established, former arena fighters who had won their freedom from pits he had overseen. But they weren't there for revenge. They sat with quiet dignity, many taking notes, some conferring with what appeared to be legal advisors. This wasn't a mob seeking blood. It was a courtroom filled with people seeking justice. Commander Zethkar, the chief judge continued, you stand accused of systematic genocide against 17 distinct civilizations, the enslavement of approximately 4 billion sapient beings, the destruction of irreplaceable cultural artifacts and historical sites, and the conducting of aggressive warfare in violation of established galactic law. How do you respond to these charges, Zethkar? Had been trained for interrogation resistance, psychological warfare, and military tribunals. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. The question wasn't whether he had done these things. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The question was whether he had the courage to face what he had done. I was following the military doctrine of my people, he said finally. I was executing lawful orders from legitimate authority within the Kethmori Empire. A murmur went through the courtroom, but it wasn't the angry response he expected. Instead, he heard what sounded like sympathy. The defendant claims defense under military authority, the chief judge noted. Counselor Chen, please present your opening statement. Dr. Chen rose from what appeared to be the prosecutor's table, but when she spoke, her voice carried none of the harsh accusations Ethmori legal tradition would have demanded. Honored judges, distinguished representatives, survivors and their families, she began. We gather today not to seek revenge, but to establish truth. Not to punish the wicked, but to understand how wickedness comes to seem normal to those who perpetrate it. She moved to the center of the chamber, her small human frame somehow commanding the attention of every being in the vast room. Commander Zethkar is guilty of the charges against him. The evidence will show that he personally oversaw the conquest of 17 worlds, the enslavement of billions, and the systematic destruction of entire civilizations. But the question before this tribunal isn't whether he did these things, it's why he did them, and what we as a galactic community must do to ensure they never happen again. Dr. Chen gestured to a holographic display that materialized above the courtroom, showing images from Kethmori worlds. But instead of the military installations and victory monuments Zethkar expected, the display showed schools, nurseries, civilian populations going about their daily lives. The prosecution will demonstrate that the Kethmori Empire isn't a military organization that happens to govern worlds. It's an entire civilization that has been systematically conditioned to view conquest and domination as not just acceptable, but morally necessary. Every Kethmori citizen, from birth to death, is taught that their survival depends on their ability to dominate other species. The display shifted to show Kethmori educational facilities, where young members of their species learned tactical analysis alongside basic mathematics, where combat training was integrated into every aspect of childhood development. We will show that Commander Zethkar, like every member of his species, was raised from infancy to believe that the galaxy is divided into predators and prey, and that any species capable of interstellar travel but unwilling to engage in conquest is inherently weak and deserving of subjugation. Zethkar found himself staring at images of his own childhood, somehow captured by human intelligence operations that had penetrated deeper into Kethmori society than he would have thought possible. There he was as a youngling, learning to track and hunt. There were his first tactical exercises, his early combat training, his indoctrination into the military academies. But we will also demonstrate, Dr. Chen continued, that this conditioning is not genetic, not inevitable, and not irreversible. We will present evidence that Kethmori who have been removed from their cultural environment and given access to alternative perspectives can and do develop ethical frameworks that reject conquest and embrace cooperation. The display now showed something that made Zethkar's mind reel. Kethmori individuals working alongside humans and other species in what appeared to be research facilities, medical centers, and educational institutions. They weren't prisoners or slaves, they were colleagues, their natural tactical abilities being used for peaceful purposes, their analytical minds applied to problems of healing and building rather than conquest and destruction. The prosecution believes that Commander Zethkar, like every member of his species, is a victim as well as a perpetrator. A victim of a culture that taught him that mass murder was patriotism, that systematic oppression was duty, that the suffering of others was not merely acceptable, but praiseworthy. Dr. Chen turned to look directly at Zethkar, and her expression held something he had never seen directed at him before. Genuine compassion for someone who had caused immeasurable suffering. But being a victim doesn't absolve someone of responsibility for their actions, and understanding how someone became capable of such acts doesn't diminish the reality of the harm they caused or the obligation to ensure they never cause such harm again. She returned to the center of the chamber, and her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. The prosecution seeks not execution, not imprisonment, not revenge. We seek rehabilitation. We seek the systematic dismantling of the cultural structures that made these crimes seem not just acceptable but honorable. We seek the transformation of an entire civilization from predators into partners. The courtroom fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Zethkar felt his worldview cracking like old armor under too much stress. The prosecution calls its first witness, Dr. Chen announced, Survivor Testimony Coordinator Jex Wari of the Free Morkan Fighter Wings. The Morkan pilot he had seen earlier approached the witness area, but instead of the vengeful tirade Zethkar expected, her voice was calm and measured. I was 7 years old when the Kethmori conquered my homeworld, she began. My parents were killed in the initial bombardment. I was taken to Processing Center Gamma 7, where I was classified as suitable for light manufacturing work.
She gestured, and the holographic display showed images that made Zethkar uncomfortable in ways he couldn't define. Not because they were particularly graphic, but because they were so ordinary.
Children working in factories, sleeping in dormitories, eating standardized meals. The systematic reduction of sapient beings to economic units. I spent 12 years in that facility, Jexwari continued. I watched friends die from overwork, from malnutrition, from despair. I watched the Kethmori guards casually eliminate anyone who showed signs of rebellion or independent thinking. I learned that resistance was futile, that cooperation was survival, that hope was dangerous. Her voice remained steady, but Zethkar could see the pain in her eyes. When I finally escaped, I expected to spend the rest of my life running, hiding, trying to forget what had been done to my people. Instead, I found something I had never expected to see again. The display shifted to show images of Morkan refugees being welcomed into human space, being offered not just shelter but education, training, opportunities to rebuild their lives. I found humans who didn't want to use my survival skills for their own purposes, but who wanted to help me use them to prevent other children from experiencing what I had experienced. They didn't treat me as a damaged victim to be pitied or as a useful tool to be exploited. They treated me as a person who had valuable experience and perspectives that could help solve a galactic problem. Jexwari turned to look directly at Zethkar, and her gaze held no hatred, no desire for revenge. Instead, it held something far more unsettling, understanding. Commander, I don't hate you. I don't even hate the guards who ran the processing center where I spent my childhood. You are all doing what your culture taught you was right and necessary, but that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean it should continue. She gestured to the diverse crowd filling the courtroom gallery. Every being in this room represents a choice, Commander. The choice to respond to harm with healing, to answer violence with justice, to meet hatred with the kind of love that demands better from everyone involved. We're not here to destroy the Kethmori Empire. We're here to help it become something better. As Jexwari returned to her seat, Zethkar found himself facing a truth that his military training had never prepared him to confront. The beings he had conquered, enslaved, and brutalized weren't seeking to inflict the same suffering on him and his people. They were trying to save them from themselves. Dr. Chen approached the witness area again. The prosecution calls its next witness, Cultural Analysis Specialist Dr. Kethmoran, formerly commander of the 3rd Assault Fleet of the Kethmori Empire. The being who approached the witness stand was unmistakably Kethmori, but everything about him was different from any member of their species Zethkar had ever encountered. His posture spoke of confidence without aggression, strength without dominance. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had found peace with himself. I was like you once, Zethkar, he said, using the informal address that would have been a grave insult in Kethmori military culture. I conquered 6 worlds for the Empire. I processed thousands of prisoners. I believed that our survival depended on our ability to dominate others. He gestured, and the display showed images of him in his military prime, standing over conquered cities, reviewing files of captured populations. I was captured during a raid on a human research station 23 years ago. I expected torture, execution, or at best processing into their slave labor systems. Instead, they offered me something I had never imagined possible: The display shifted to show him in what appeared to be a classroom, surrounded by humans and representatives of other species. They offered me education, not indoctrination, not propaganda, but genuine education. The opportunity to learn about other cultures, other perspectives, other ways of understanding the galaxy. They showed me that the universe isn't divided into predators and prey, but into beings who choose to build and beings who choose to destroy. Dr. Ball Kethmaran turned to face Zethkar directly. They taught me that our people's greatest strength isn't our ability to conquer, but our ability to analyze, to understand complex systems, to solve difficult problems. They showed me that these abilities could be used to heal instead of harm, to create instead of destroy. He spread his arms, encompassing the vast courtroom filled with representatives of dozens of species working together. Look around you, Zethkar. See what cooperation can accomplish. See what becomes possible when intelligent beings choose to work together instead of fighting each other. This tribunal, this station, this entire network of civilizations working toward justice, none of it would exist if our people's analytical abilities had been used to build bridges instead of weapons. As Dr. Kethmaran returned to his seat, Zethkar realized that everything he thought he knew about strength, about survival, about what it meant to be Keth Mori, was crumbling around him. And for the first time in his 500-year life, he wasn't sure that was a bad thing. The trial continued for 18 days, and each day brought revelations that systematically dismantled everything Commander Zethkar had believed about the nature of existence. Witness after witness took the stand, not to condemn him, but to illustrate the vast scope of possibilities that opened up when intelligence was applied to cooperation instead of conquest. On the seventh day, they brought in economists who demonstrated how much energy and resources the galaxy wasted on conflict that could have been used for exploration and development. On the 10th day, philosophers from 12 different species engaged in discussions about the nature of consciousness and ethical responsibility that made Zethkar question fundamental assumptions he had never realized he was making. But it was on the 15th day that something inside him finally broke. Dr. Chen called a witness, whose presence in the courtroom seemed to shift the very atmosphere. She was elderly by human standards, her hair white and her movements careful. But when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen the absolute worst of what sapient beings could do to each other, and had somehow found a way to forgive it. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," Chen requested gently. "My name is Sarah Martinez," the woman said, "and I am the director of the Trauma Recovery Institute for Survivors of Systematic Oppression." "Dr. Martinez, how many survivors have you worked with over your career?" "Approximately 40 to 3,000 individuals from 80 to 7 different species, spanning 4 decades of practice." The number hit Zethkar like a physical blow. 43,000 beings whose lives had been shattered by people like him, whose minds and spirits had been broken by systems he had helped maintain. "Dr. Martinez, can you explain to the tribunal what systematic oppression does to a sapient mind?" The elderly human settled back in her chair, her expression becoming something profound and sad. "Systematic oppression creates a condition we call learned helplessness. When individuals are repeatedly subjected to trauma they cannot control or escape, their minds develop defensive mechanisms that prioritize immediate survival over long-term resistance. They learn that fighting back leads to worse punishment, so they stop fighting. They learn that hope leads to disappointment, so they stop hoping." She gestured to the holographic display which showed brain scans from dozens of different species. "But the most insidious aspect of systematic oppression isn't what it does to its victims, it's what it does to its perpetrators. When individuals are raised in cultures that require them to inflict trauma on others as a condition of their own survival, they develop psychological defenses that allow them to function despite causing immense suffering." The display shifted to show Keth Mori neural patterns, and Zethkar was disturbed to see his own brain among the samples. Perpetrators learn to dehumanize their victims, to see them as fundamentally different from themselves. They develop narratives that justify their actions, frameworks that make cruelty seem not just necessary, but virtuous. They construct entire worldviews built around the premise that their survival depends on the subjugation of others. Dr. Martinez looked directly at Zethkar, and her gaze held something that made his soul ache. "Commander, you were trained from birth to believe that causing suffering was strength, that showing mercy was weakness, that the screams of your victims were proof of your superiority. Your entire sense of identity, your understanding of your own worth, has been built on a foundation of necessary cruelty." Zethkar found that he couldn't meet her eyes. Everything she was saying felt true in ways that made him want to curl into a defensive shell. "But here's what we've learned from working with 43,000 survivors, Commander. Trauma isn't permanent, Learned helplessness can be unlearned. The psychological patterns that allow people to inflict systematic cruelty can be rewired. Healing is possible even for the worst damage imaginable. She stood up from her chair and walked to the center of the courtroom, addressing not just Zethkar but the entire assembly. The question isn't whether Commander Zethkar is responsible for his actions. He is. The question isn't whether those actions caused immense suffering. They did. The question is whether we, as a galactic community, believe that people can change, whether we think redemption is possible, whether we have the courage to choose healing over vengeance. Dr. Martinez returned to the witness area, but continued speaking directly to Zethkar. I've worked with Kethmori survivors before, Commander. Former members of your military who were captured, who spent years in our treatment programs, who slowly learned to see the universe through different eyes. I've watched beings who were raised to be instruments of domination discover that they could be agents of healing instead. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the vast courtroom. But I've also worked with survivors of Kethmori conquest, beings who spent decades in your processing centers and arena pits. And do you know what they've taught me, Commander? They've taught me that the capacity for cruelty exists in every sapient species, that under the right conditions, with the right cultural pressures, any civilization could become what yours became. The courtroom fell completely silent, which means that if we respond to your empire's cruelty with cruelty of our own, if we answer your domination with domination, if we meet your violence with violence, we risk becoming exactly what we're trying to stop. She looked around the chamber, taking in the representatives of dozens of different species. So we have a choice to make. We can prove that we're better than the Kethmori Empire by doing to you what you did to others. Or we can prove that we're better by doing something your culture has never attempted, choosing justice over revenge, rehabilitation over retribution, healing over harm. Dr. Poplis Martinez returned to her seat, and the courtroom remained silent for several long minutes. Then Dr. Chan approached the center of the chamber. The prosecution rests, she announced. But before we proceed to deliberation, I would like to offer Commander Zethkar the opportunity to address the tribunal. Zethkar felt every eye in the chamber focus on him. For the first time in his military career, he found himself facing a situation where tactical analysis was useless, where weapons and armor and centuries of combat experience meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was his willingness to confront the truth about what he had done and what he had become. He stood up slowly, his massive frame somehow feeling fragile in the vast space of the courtroom. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had ever been in a command situation. I don't know what to say, he began, the words feeling strange and inadequate. Everything I thought I knew about the galaxy, about my people, about myself, it's all been wrong. He gestured to the gallery filled with survivors, their faces showing not hatred, but something far more complex and challenging.
I expected you to want revenge.
I expected torture, execution, the systematic destruction of my empire in payment for what we did to your worlds. Instead, you've shown me something I didn't know was possible. Zethkar looked around the chamber, taking in the representatives of dozens of species working together, the evidence of cooperation and healing and justice that surrounded him. You've shown me that strength doesn't come from the ability to dominate others, but from the ability to help others become stronger. You've shown me that survival doesn't require the subjugation of potential threats, but the transformation of enemies into allies. His voice broke slightly as the weight of centuries of actions finally became clear to him. I am responsible for the deaths of millions of sapient beings. I am responsible for the enslavement of billions more. I am responsible for the destruction of cultures and histories and possibilities that can never be recovered. No amount of understanding about how I became capable of such things can diminish the reality of what I chose to do.
He turned to look directly at Dr. Martinez.
But you asked whether I can change, whether redemption is possible, whether someone who has spent centuries inflicting systematic cruelty can learn to be something else. Zethkar straightened to his full height, and for the first time since his capture, his posture spoke not of military dominance but of moral courage. I don't know if I can change. I don't know if the damage I've done to my own mind and soul can be healed. But I know that I want to try. I know that I want to spend whatever time I have left working to undo as much harm as possible. I know that I want to use whatever analytical abilities I possess to help build instead of destroy. The silence in the courtroom was profound and complete. I submit myself to the judgment of this tribunal, not because I expect mercy, but because I trust your wisdom more than my own. I trust your ability to determine what justice looks like more than I trust my ability to understand what I deserve. As Zethkar returned to his seat, He felt something he had never experienced before, not the satisfaction of victory or the determination of a warrior facing death, but the quiet peace that comes from finally telling the truth. The tribunal deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the chief judge spoke with the gravity appropriate to a decision that would establish precedent for how galactic civilization would handle crimes of such magnitude. Commander Zethkar, this tribunal finds you guilty of all charges brought against you. The evidence is overwhelming, and your own testimony confirms your responsibility for acts of systematic genocide, mass enslavement, and aggressive warfare. Zethkar felt a strange calm settle over him as he waited for the sentence. However, this tribunal also finds that you are yourself a victim of systematic conditioning designed to make such acts seem not just acceptable, but necessary. We find that the cultural structures of the Kethmori Empire bear primary responsibility for creating the circumstances that made your crimes possible. The chief judge paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of hope. Therefore, this tribunal sentences you to supervise rehabilitation under the direction of the Trauma Recovery Institute, with the goal of eventual reintegration into galactic society as a productive member of the community. You will spend the remainder of your natural life working to repair the damage you have caused, using your analytical abilities and military knowledge to help develop better systems for preventing and responding to systematic oppression. The judge's expression became something profound and challenging. But your sentence comes with conditions, Commander. You will serve as a case study for the rehabilitation of perpetrators of systematic violence. Your progress will be monitored, documented, and shared with others facing similar challenges. Your recovery will become a resource for helping other beings learn that change is possible. Zethkar felt tears, an emotional response he hadn't experienced since childhood, beginning to form in his eyes. Most importantly, you will serve as a bridge between your empire and the galactic community. You will help us understand how to approach other Kethmori individuals who are ready to consider alternatives to conquest. You will help us develop programs for transforming an entire civilization from predators into partners. The chief judge stood, and the entire assembly followed his example. This tribunal believes that justice is not served by perpetuating cycles of violence, but by breaking them. We believe that strength is demonstrated not by our ability to punish those who have wronged us, but by our ability to help them become better than they were. As the session adjourned, Zethkar found himself surrounded not by guards or jailers, but by people who introduced themselves as counselors, educators, and program coordinators. People who spoke to him not as a condemned criminal, but as someone beginning a difficult journey toward becoming the person he had always had the potential to be. And for the first time in his 500-year life, Commander Zethkar began to understand what hope felt like. 5 years after his trial, former Commander Zethkar stood in a place he had never imagined he would see again, a Kethmori nursery school on the imperial homeworld of Keth Prime. But he wasn't there as a conqueror, or even as a returning war hero. He was there as Dr. Zethkar, cognitive rehabilitation specialist, and cultural transformation consultant, watching 30 young Kethmori children learn about the galaxy in ways their parents never had. Dr. Zethkar called a small voice, and he turned to see one of his students, a youngster named Kixara, holding up a drawing that made his transformed heart ache with possibility. Instead of the traditional Kethmori artwork depicting conquest and domination, she had drawn beings from a dozen different species working together to build something beautiful. "Tell me about your picture, Kixara," he said, kneeling down to her level, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable for a Kethmori commander. "It's the new colony on Zirion 7, she explained, with the enthusiasm that only children could bring to describing their vision of the future. "My cousin Dexalon is working there with the Zirion engineers to build cities that can house different species together. See, this part is designed for beings who breathe methane, and this part is for oxygen breathers, and they're connected by these tubes where everyone can meet and work together." Zethkar studied the drawing, marveling at how naturally this child conceived of cooperation between species his generation had been taught to view as enemies. The transformation of Kethmori society hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't happened without conflict, but it was happening. "That's beautiful work," he told her. "What made you think of drawing this?" "My parents showed me pictures from when you were fighting everyone," Kixara said with the blunt honesty that children wielded like precision instruments. "They said you used to think we had to hurt other people to be strong, but then you learned that helping people was stronger. They said that's why we learn about cooperation now instead of conquest." The simple summary of his 5-year journey of rehabilitation made Zethkar smile in ways that still surprised him. The process of unlearning 5 centuries of conditioning hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, moments when his old programming reasserted itself, times when the temptation to fall back on familiar patterns of dominance had nearly overwhelmed his commitment to change. But Dr. Martinez had warned him that healing wasn't linear, that progress came in waves rather than straight lines. The human support network that had helped hundreds of former Kethmori military personnel transition to peaceful roles had prepared him for the difficulty of rebuilding an identity based on creation rather than destruction.
Dr.
Zethkar, another voice called, and he looked up to see his colleague Dr. Sixandra approaching. The former Zirion gladiator had become one of the most effective coordinators of interspecies educational programs. Her experience in both Kethmori combat pits and human rehabilitation centers giving her unique insights into transformation processes. The council meeting is starting in 20 minutes, she reminded him. Are you ready for today's presentation? Zethkar nodded, though he felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that accompanied major milestones in his new life. Today he would address the Kethmori Imperial Council, the same governing body that had once approved his conquest campaigns, to present his recommendations for the complete restructuring of their civilization's educational and military systems. The journey to the council chambers took them through parts of the capital city that showed the visible signs of cultural transformation. Where once massive monuments to military victories had dominated the skyline, new structures celebrating scientific achievement, artistic expression, and cultural exchange reached toward the stars. The change hadn't been universally welcomed. Significant portions of Kethmori society still struggled with the shift away from their warrior traditions, but progress was undeniable. Nervous? Dr. Sixandra asked as they entered the government complex. Terrified, Zethkar admitted. 5 years ago, I was one of their most successful commanders. Now I'm asking them to abandon everything that made us who we thought we were. You're asking them to become who they actually are, she corrected gently. Under all that conditioning, under all that programming about conquest and domination, the Kethmori have always been natural systems analysts and problem solvers.
You're just suggesting they apply those abilities to different problems.
The council chambers had been redesigned as part of the cultural transformation process. Instead of a hierarchical arrangement that emphasized dominance and submission, the new configuration created a circular space where every participant could see and interact with every other participant. Representatives from other species sat alongside Kethmori council members, their presence a visible reminder that isolation was no longer an option. Council members, distinguished guests, Zethkar began when called upon to present his findings. 5 years ago, I stood trial for crimes against 17 different civilizations. Today, I stand before you with evidence that those crimes were not aberrations, not the actions of a few bad individuals, but the inevitable result of a cultural system designed to produce exactly the kind of behavior I demonstrated. He gestured to holographic displays showing statistical analyses of Kethmori society. Our traditional education system produces individuals who are extremely capable at tactical analysis, resource optimization, and complex problem solving. But it channels those abilities exclusively toward domination and conquest. We create brilliant minds and then train them to see intelligence as a weapon rather than a tool for building. The display shifted to show comparative data from other species, but we've now had 5 years to study what happens when Kethmori individuals are given access to alternative frameworks for understanding their place in the galaxy. The results are remarkable. Images appeared showing Kethmori working in research facilities, medical centers, educational institutions, and engineering projects across dozens of worlds. Former military personnel who underwent rehabilitation programs are now contributing to advances in interstellar navigation, xenobiology, trauma recovery techniques, and conflict resolution methodologies. Their analytical abilities, when applied to construction rather than destruction. He paused, looking around the chamber at faces that showed everything from enthusiastic support to barely contained hostility. The evidence suggests that our species' greatest strength was never our ability to conquer others, but our ability to understand complex systems. We've been using that strength to tear apart civilizations when we could have been using it to build better ones. Council leader Korthvex, an old guard conservative who had opposed many of the transformation initiatives, raised a challenge that Zethkar had been expecting. Dr. Zethkar, your rehabilitation may have convinced you that cooperation is superior to conquest, but you ask us to abandon traditions that have ensured our survival for millennia. How do we know that abandoning our warrior culture won't leave us vulnerable to other predator species? It was a fair question and one that Zethkar had spent considerable time researching. Council leader, our intelligence networks now extend across 87 different civilizations. We have access to information about threats and opportunities throughout the galaxy. What we've discovered is that the universe contains very few actual predator species, but it contains many species that have developed predatory behaviors in response to perceived threats. The display shifted to show a galactic map with threat assessments and alliance networks. Most conflicts in galactic history have been caused not by inherently aggressive species, but by defensive responses to expansion pressure from empires like ours. By abandoning conquest as our primary mode of interaction, we've eliminated the conditions that created most of our enemies. Dr. Saxandra approached the presentation area to add her perspective. Council members, I spent 15 years as a gladiator in Kethmori arena pits. I learned to fight because fighting was the only way to survive in the system you created. But when I was given access to alternatives, I discovered that my combat skills could be repurposed for protection and peacekeeping, rather than entertainment and domination. She gestured to images of interspecies security forces working to maintain peace in contested regions. The same abilities that made Kethmori effective conquerors make them exceptionally effective peacekeepers. Our tactical analysis skills, our physical capabilities, our understanding of conflict dynamics, all of these can be used to prevent wars rather than start them. The discussion continued for several hours, with representatives from various factions raising concerns, proposing modifications, and debating implementation timelines. But gradually a consensus emerged around a comprehensive transformation program that would reshape Kethmori's society over the course of several generations. As the session concluded, Zethkar found himself approached by a young Kethmori officer whose insignia indicated recent graduation from the military academy. Dr. Kathalina Bever, Zethkar, she said with the careful formality of someone addressing a figure of controversial reputation. My name is Lieutenant Bexkara. I've been studying your work on rehabilitation methodologies, and I have questions. I'm happy to answer them, Zethkar replied, recognizing in her expression the same confusion and conflict he had experienced during his own early rehabilitation. Sir, I was trained to believe that our strength came from our willingness to do what other species couldn't or wouldn't do, that our survival depended on being harder, more ruthless, more willing to make difficult choices than anyone else. But your research suggests that this approach actually made us weaker, not stronger. She looked around the chamber, taking in the diverse group of beings working together on complex problems. How do I reconcile what I was taught about strength with what I'm seeing here? Zethkar considered the question carefully. It was one he had asked himself many times during his own transformation process. Lieutenant, I think the error in our traditional thinking was assuming that strength could only be measured by our ability to impose our will on others. But look around this chamber. Look at what we've accomplished in 5 years by learning to work with other species instead of against them. He gestured to the holographic displays still showing the scope of interspecies cooperation. We've gained access to technologies and perspectives that we never could have developed in isolation. We've solved problems that individual species couldn't handle alone. We've created security and prosperity for billions of beings across dozens of worlds. Zethkar met the young officer's eyes directly. That's not weakness, Lieutenant. That's strength of a kind we never imagined when we thought that dominance was the only form of power worth pursuing. As they left the council chambers, Dr. Saxandra walked beside him in comfortable silence for several blocks before speaking. How do you think it went? She asked. Better than I expected, Zethkar replied honestly. 5 years ago, half of them would have called for my execution just for suggesting that conquest wasn't our destiny. Today, we had genuine debate about implementation strategies. They paused at a public plaza where Kethmori children were playing with youngsters from several other species, their games involving cooperation and creativity rather than competition and dominance. Do you ever miss it? Saxandra asked quietly. The certainty of the old way? The clarity of having enemies to fight and territories to conquer? Zethkar watched the children playing, considering the question that went to the heart of his transformation. I miss the simplicity, he admitted. It was easier when the universe was divided into predators and prey, when every problem could be solved through the application of superior force. But Saxandra, look at what we built. Look at what becomes possible when intelligence is applied to cooperation instead of conquest. A human child, barely 5 years old, was showing a Kethmori youngling how to construct something with building blocks. The Kethmori child was applying the same analytical skills that would have been used for tactical planning to the problem of architectural stability, while the human child was contributing creative insights about aesthetic design. I don't miss the old certainties, Zethkar continued, because I've learned that uncertainty is the price of possibility. When we thought we knew exactly how the universe worked, when we believed that domination was the only path to security, we closed ourselves off from discoveries we couldn't imagine. He turned to look at his colleague and friend. Someone whose own journey from gladiator to peacekeeper had been just as remarkable as his transformation from conqueror to healer. The old way was predictable, but it was also limited. We could conquer worlds, but we couldn't build galaxies. We could dominate individuals, but we couldn't create communities. We could inspire fear, but we couldn't inspire hope. As the two former enemies turned allies walked home through streets filled with beings from dozens of species working, playing, and living together, Zethkar reflected on how completely his understanding of strength had changed. 5 years ago, he had measured his worth by his ability to make others submit to his will. Today, he measured it by his ability to help others become stronger than they had been. 5 years ago, he had seen the galaxy as a battlefield where only the strongest could survive. Today, he saw it as a community where everyone could thrive. The transformation of the Kethmori Empire was far from complete. There were still holdout factions that rejected cooperation in favor of traditional warrior values. There were still individuals who struggled to adapt to frameworks based on building rather than destroying. There were still setbacks, conflicts, and moments when the old patterns reasserted themselves. But progress was undeniable. Every day brought new examples of former predators learning to be partners, of analytical minds being applied to problems of healing rather than harming, of a species discovering that their greatest strength had never been their ability to dominate others, but their potential to help others flourish. And sometimes, late at night, when he reviewed reports from rehabilitation programs across the galaxy, Zethkar would remember the moment when a small human woman had looked him in the eyes and told him that his people had picked the wrong species to hunt. She had been right, of course, but not in the way he had understood at the time. Humanity hadn't been the wrong species to hunt because they were too dangerous to defeat. They had been the wrong species to hunt because they were too wise to remain enemies. They had taken beings raised to be instruments of domination and shown them how to become agents of liberation. They had met conquest with compassion, answered violence with justice, and responded to hatred with the kind of love that demanded better from everyone involved. The galaxy was becoming a better place, not because the strong had triumphed over the weak, but because the wise had chosen to help the strong become good.